good morning. We've been spending time here in the 2nd century, and a couple things that happened in the 2nd century over the course of the 2nd century are really significant as we think about the history of the church. The 2nd century is the beginning of the age of the great church. And, this era, the patristic era, the area of Irenaeus of Lyon and Cyprian of Carthage and Origen of Alexandria and John Chrysostom at Constantinople and Augustine at Hippo. Origen called it the age of the church of the multitudes. But several of these use the term the great church in this era. And so here's what Irenaeus wrote about the church in this era. The church, though dispersed through the whole world, even to the ends of the earth, has received from the apostles and their disciples this faith. As I've already observed, the church, having received this preaching and this faith, although scattered throughout the whole world, yet as if occupying but one house, carefully preserves it. For the churches which have been planted in Germany do not believe or hand down anything different, nor do those in Spain, nor those in Gaul, nor those in the East, nor those in Egypt, nor those in Libya, nor those which have been established in the central regions of the world. But as the Son, that creature of God, is one and the same throughout the whole world, so also the preaching of the truth shines everywhere and enlightens all men that are willing to come to a knowledge of the truth. And so, one of the things that is fascinating and exciting about the church in the 2nd century is it's one church, one fully united church across most of the known world. It's an undivided fellowship across nations and language. There has been no schism. There's been no separation of the church to this point. And so this is the era of the great church, a church that is truly Catholic, small c, universal, fully united together. A church, one church, fully united, which is mainly across the Roman and Persian empires, but goes far beyond that, into southern India, into Central Asia, and into the German tribes already. And this is a church, great church, the era of the great church is held together by occasional letters, which are written and circulated here and there, and by some personal relationships among key leaders. There's not a lot of lateral communication in this era, but there is a significant commitment to a consistent system of belief. And so there are fundamentals of theology that are unity here. One, there is no contest across the whole church about Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, a God of one substance in three persons. There is no dispute that there is a coming apocalypse and that Jesus will return in power and that will be followed by a general judgment of all, that every person will stand in judgment. And so there is little dispute about the power and authority of what we consider to be the New Testament. There is some dispute about what pieces fall into this, but by the end of the 2nd century, 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is accepted by the whole church everywhere. Writing of Paul, the core writings of Paul are accepted by the whole church everywhere. Everyone reads the epistle to the Romans, among other things. So there are core things which are holding this church together at this time. And there's a rejection of Gnosticism. There's a rejection of the Judaizers. The Marcionites Marcion's ideas have been rejected. Montanus and his ideas have been rejected. What's called adoptionism has been considered and rejected. Adoptionism is the idea that Jesus was born as a person to Mary and Joseph, and he grew up and he was a particularly holy young man. And when he went to be baptized by John the Baptist, God was so impressed by him that God sent his Spirit down and adopted Jesus as his Son in that moment. And that statement, "This is my beloved Son," is the first moment that Jesus knew. And that suddenly he was the Son of God because he'd been adopted by God in that moment. And then he went and had this ministry because he had been adopted by God to be his man on earth, as it were. And so this is a thing that was, many people talked about this in the second century, and by the end of the second century, this had been rejected as untrue, as heresy. So the church in the era of the great church is plagued by splinter sects, by little groups that go off this way and that way, but it is an undivided church with a real focus on what constitutes orthodox belief, what constitutes orthodox teaching. There's localized authority. In the middle of the first century, in AD 50, when the apostles met to consider issues about whether to become a Christian you had to be a Jew first, when they had the great apostolic council in AD 50, they went to Jerusalem. It was where most of the apostles were still based. It was regarded as the center of the church. By a century later, in AD 150, Jerusalem was peripheral to the church, partly because the Romans had besieged it and knocked down the wall and torn down the temple in AD 70. And then the second Jewish revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt in AD 135, had resulted in the Roman destruction of most of the city and their expulsion of all the Jews from Jerusalem and from most of Judea. And the Romans creating a law that made it illegal for Jewish people to come within sight of the city of Jerusalem, to come to a place where they could actually see it on a distant hillside. And so they gave Jerusalem a different name and refounded the city as a Roman city with no Jews in it. And so by 150 AD, Jerusalem is a Roman city with no Jews in it at all. And the church in Jerusalem, most of the church in Jerusalem in AD 68 or 69 went to Pella, across the Jordan, before the siege of Jerusalem, during the first Jewish revolt. And so Pella and some cities further east have become important centers of the church. But by AD 150, Jerusalem is no longer a significant center of the church. And although there are those that respect Rome as a significant place that the church is a center of the church, because that's where both Peter and Paul had been martyred, and it was the big city that was the center of the empire, and so it was important in a lot of other ways. It was a transportation hub and governmental important, but there's still really localized authority across the church in AD 150 and through the end of the second century. So you do see in the second century the Jewish parts of the church, there starts to be some separation. Now, the Jewish parts of the church, many people think, oh yeah, that went away in like the second century or the third century. That is not true. There remained a major amount of Jewish people in the church and a significant Jewish presence in the church for centuries. But by the end of the second century, there are people that are referring to the church of the circumcision and the church of the Gentiles. And so even though there aren't significantly different beliefs in these two groups, there's become some cultural division. They're not organized differently. They don't have some specific dispute, but there is some clear cultural division. But nominally, the area of the great church goes all the way to AD 451. The Council at Chalcedon results in the dispute between the church in the East and the church in the West not being resolved, and the first great schism, the first great division in the church. But from sometime in the 2nd century on, we have this issue of the great church, this church dispersed across many languages and many places, across basically the whole known world. People know of China, and there's no church in China in the 2nd century. But there's church in India, there's church in Britain, there's church in Germany, which is mostly tribal peoples outside the Roman Empire. There's church on the north side of the Black Sea, where the people are known in the New Testament as Scythians, which is a kind way of saying barbarians. People in the Roman Empire, people in the Greek-speaking world regarded the people on the north side of the Black Sea as tribal barbarians from some ancient past that were people that you could not have any relationship with at all. And yet, Paul actually lists that. It's one of Paul's examples. You know, who's in the church? Jews and Greeks and men and women and slaves and free and Romans and Scythians. And these are great contrasts. And so the church has gone forth in many places. There's a church in Armenia, well beyond the Roman Empire. Churches across most of the Persian Empire by the end of the 2nd century. And so there are not big churches almost anywhere. Many cities have a church that has, a few dozen or maybe 100 people in it. But there are churches in almost every major city in the Roman Empire by the end of the 2nd century. And significant church hubs in places like Rome and Antioch and Alexandria and Ephesus, which are 4 of the 6 or 7 major cities of the empire, which have significant churches where there are leaders who are not just having local impact, but who are writing things and distributing things and having influence well beyond those cities. So the 2nd century also sees the rise of what we consider to be apologetics, defenses of the faith. You're well into the 2nd century before people start to do this, before people begin to write to the outside world. In the latter part of the 1st century, all the things that we see written are things that are written by Christians for Christians. They're written into the church. But by the end of the 2nd century, we're starting to see things that are written to outsiders, that are written outside the church, apologetics, explaining the faith to people who don't know. So next slide. A 2nd century apologetic that has been handed down to us is the epistle to Diognetus. And that's a Greek name of probably a Roman person, except Diognetus means God-born. So it might not actually be the name of a person. Nobody knows who wrote this. The person that wrote it refers to themselves only once, and they refer to themselves as the disciple, without saying who that is. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor in the middle of the 2nd century, had a tutor named Diognetus. And Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, writes about Diognetus as a man that he admired for his freedom from superstition and his sound educational advice. But that's probably not the person that this was written to. But this is from sometime in the 2nd century. And it's a work that survived because it was combined with some works of Justin Martyr from a century later. And it was discovered in a single manuscript from the 13th century at some point, and published for the first time in 1592. We no longer have the 13th century manuscript of this because it was held at Strasbourg in France, and it was burned during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 when the place it was in caught fire. And the epistle that we have is not complete. There are 10 chapters discussing pagan and Jewish religions and the life of a Christian as contrasted with the life of a non-Christian, and a review of the Christian faith. But one of those chapters has a big gap in the middle of it. And, we don't know how much of it is missing. And then there are 2 chapters that seem kind of tagged on after an apparent gap, and they seem like maybe they're parts of a sermon that were written by somebody else at some other time. The epistle does not refer to Jesus by name. It refers to the Logos, the living Word, but capital L, as it were, and it's clearly an embodied living Word, which is a clear reference to Jesus. It's not clear how widely distributed this was at the time because none of the patristic writers refer to it. But it is considered today as a very excellent example of an early apologetic. And so it starts by making some basic statements about the faith and then saying, look, the mythological gods that Romans believe in are ridiculous and stupid, and it makes no sense to believe in that stuff. And then there's a whole thing about how Christians are not Jews. And then this is chapter 5 of the 10. This is all of chapter 5, so that's why the text is so small. But I wanted to put this one up because chapter 5 is called The Manners of the Christians. And so this is a 2nd century writer defending the faith, explaining what they think Christians look like, what they think Christians live like, what they think it means to be a Christian. So, for the Christians are distinguished from other men, neither by country, nor language, nor the customs which they observe, for they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a particular form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity. The course of conduct which they follow has not been devised by any speculation or deliberation of inquisitive men, nor do they, like some, proclaim themselves the advocates of any merely human doctrines, but inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, according as the lot of each of them has been determined, and following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing and food and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth is a land of strangers. They marry, as do all. They beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things and yet abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonor are glorified. They are evil spoken of, and yet are with honor. They are reviled and bless. They are insulted and repay the insult with honor. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice as if quickened into life. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners and are persecuted by the Greeks, yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. That's a description from the 2nd century, what the Christian life looks like. It's not a bad model for us. So, next slide. This is chapter 6 from the Epistle to Diognetus, which is called The Relation of Christians to the World. What do Christians do to connect to the world? To sum up all in one word, what the soul is in the body, Christians are in the world. The soul is dispersed through all the members of the body, and Christians are scattered through all the cities of the world. The soul dwells in the body, yet it is not of the body. And Christians dwell in the world, yet are not of the world. The invisible soul is guarded by the visible body. And Christians are known indeed to be in the world, but their godliness remains invisible. The flesh hates the soul and wars against it, though itself suffering no injury, because it is prevented from enjoying pleasures. The world also hates the Christians, though they are no wise injured by them, because they abjure pleasures. The soul loves the flesh, and that hates it, and loves also the members. Christians likewise love those that hate them. The soul is imprisoned in the body, it keeps together that very body. And Christians are confined in the world as in a prison, and yet they keep together the world. The immortal soul dwells in a mortal tabernacle, and Christians dwell as sojourners in corruptible bodies, looking for an incorruptible dwelling in the heavens. The soul, when but ill provided with food and drink, becomes better. In like manner, the Christians, though subjected day by day to punishment, increase the more in number. God has assigned them this illustrious position, which it were unlawful for them to forsake. So the writer of this, the anonymous, unknown at this point writer of this, writing in the 2nd century, says, this is what Christians look like. This is what Christians do. This is how Christians live. And this is what it means to have Christians be in the world. And, when I was reading this, I thought, this is still pretty awfully good advice for us as we think about what do we do? What is our call? What is our life? What is it that we are supposed to do and how we are supposed to live in this life as His people? That, we don't dress differently than anyone else. We don't speak some different language. We don't live in our own towns, in our own cities. We don't go off and live by ourselves. But as we go forth, we live as sojourners, as foreigners. We are the people who beget offspring, beget children, and do not destroy them, unlike the people around us. So we have a common table. We are in the flesh, but do not live after the flesh. We live on this earth, but as citizens of heaven. We are called to love all men, even though we are persecuted by all those around us. We may be poor, but we make the society around us rich. When we are reviled, we bless. When we are insulted, we repay with honor. We do good, even if we are so punished as if we were evil. We are persecuted by people who don't necessarily even know why they hate us. So these are fundamental things about the way that people in the 2nd century thought about being a Christian, about being in this world, about being in the society that we are surrounded by. And these are things that still ought to be important to us in these days. And so one of the things that's really important to understand about the 2nd century church as opposed to the 1st century church is the 2nd century church, there is this real shift of focus to preaching as a way of engaging people, of teaching people, of sending this word forth. There is a huge focus on teaching Christians who've come out of this pagan society a totally different way to live, to work, to think. Not that they should come apart from them physically, but that they should live lives that are truly different. And this is different than the Jewish practice. Jews actually dressed differently and had different dietary rules and did other things to set themselves apart. Jews didn't let unbelievers into their homes. But Christians were called to welcome other people in, to dress like the people around them, except in more kind of modest ways, but to be mostly like the people around them in terms of the way that they dressed and the way that they lived, except to carry this message and to be incredibly countercultural in how they viewed right and wrong in the way they lived their lives, and to do things that people around them thought were amazingly different because of their attitudes towards women, towards children, towards one another, and towards what was right and wrong. And so this big part of the story of the church in the second century is the rise of preaching, the rise of teaching, and the focus on helping people in the church to understand how do we live as believers in the midst of a pagan and corrupting society. And these things aren't all that different from today, though 18 centuries have passed.